Good evening. David Cameron has used evidence given to the Iraq inquiry today to accuse Gordon Brown of ignoring the welfare of British troops.
The inquiry, a former top civil servant at the Ministry of Defence, said Mr Brown had slashed the military budget in the months after the invasion. But as Carol Walker reports, the Prime Minister says the defence budget has risen overall under Labour.
As Prime Minister, Gordon Brown has constantly stressed his commitment to the armed forces. But he was clearly angered today by accusations that he'd ignored their welfare by failing to provide sufficient funds when he was Chancellor. At the Iraq inquiry, a former top official at the Ministry of Defence was the latest witness to complain of Mr Brown's decisions, saying he'd arbitrarily ordered cuts 6 months after the invasion.
In September of 2003, the Chancellor of the day instituted a complete guillotine on our settlement, and it meant that we had to go in for a very major savings exercise in order to cope with what was effectively a billion reduction year on year.
Some of these people...
But the man who became Defence Secretary 2 years into the Iraq War said the military had got the money it needed.
But I have to say, and I might be the only witness you've got who's saying this, that both the Secretary to the Treasury, who subsequently became Defence Secretary, and the Chancellor, who subsequently became Prime Minister, and is Prime Minister now, gave us what we needed.
Gordon Brown might have hoped to focus on the government's strategic thinking on our future defence needs. Instead, the opposition said the Iraq inquiry showed he'd made bad decisions in the past.
David Cameron. Isn't the evidence mounting that the Prime Minister ignored the welfare of our armed forces right up until the moment until it became politically convenient to do otherwise?
We continued to increase the defence budget every year, and we made every urgent operational requirement that was necessary for Her Majesty's forces in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The Liberal Democrat leader joined the attack.
We've got troops in battle without proper equipment. We've got guillotine defence budgets, guillotine defence budgets, and a world which has changed out of all recognition since the Cold War.
Gordon Brown is correct to say that defence spending has increased on his watch, but the costs have risen even faster, with overruns on procurement amounting now to £35 billion. So the defence budget is under strain, and whoever's in power after the next election will face some very tough choices. Carol Walker, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, a little earlier, Lewis Page, who's a former naval officer, now writes for the online news service The Register, gave me this reaction to the Defence Secretary's announcement today.
Well, it's disappointing in that it doesn't really say anything concrete at all, except that, yes, some things in the current equipment programme are going to have to be cut, but no revelation as to what. What would have been nice, really, given that there's an election coming up, is for the government to say what it's going to do now. Then the Tories could say what they want to do, or the other opposition parties could say what they want to do, and people could vote on it. What's going to actually happen now is that we'll have to elect another government, and then they can do what they like.
There was quite a lot of talk in this Green Paper about sort of working in tandem with allies, perhaps to a greater extent than previously. I mean, does that mean, you know, not so much of the kind of war that we've seen in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where Britain's acting relatively independently, albeit alongside the United States?
Well, actually, in the report, most of the talk of international cooperation, there was a lot of mention of NATO and the EU and so forth, but in fact, specifically, it mentioned the United States, and yes, we are pretty much joined at the hip with them anyway. As it says in the report, we're completely reliant on them for any sort of space capability, satellites and so on, and very heavily reliant in intelligence and certain other things. So that's a given. We'll always cooperate with the Americans, and hopefully they'll always cooperate with us. Beyond that, it's pretty difficult to see what's really going to change. The great snag of international cooperation is it only works if everyone wants to cooperate. So more elaborate plans, as for example, for giving different military roles to different nations to take on. For instance, one nation would do artillery and another would do other parts of an army. very difficult to make that work because, as we've seen in Afghanistan, different nations always put very heavy caveats on how their forces can be used. Famously, the German armed forces are only allowed to operate in certain safer areas of Afghanistan. So if they were in charge of something you needed, you wouldn't be able to have it.
What in your view would be the easiest way to cut defence spending decisively?
The simplest and easiest way, and I'm not at all hopeful that this will happen, but the easiest way would be to just buy our equipment off the shelf. Quite often importing it, that would mean. And you would get better equipment much more cheaply and much more quickly because you'd be able to take advantage of economies of scale. We don't do that. We nearly always pay through the nose to reinvent the wheel here in Britain. And as a result, our equipment costs far, far more than it needs to. And I'm afraid in the Green Paper, strong signs are given that we're going to keep on doing that. So that option for saving a lot of money won't be there. And what will actually happen is that we'll cut down on people and or kit, which would be a shame.
And when you talk about kit, I mean, you know, aircraft carriers, for example, that's often cited as one, you know, swift way of saving an awful lot of money. Do you think something like that would whichever party wins the election, is something like that vulnerable?
Well, something like that will have to go if we don't do something else, if we don't start buying off the shelf, if we carry on with the industrial policy that we've got at the moment. Some major thing will have to go. The carriers, in fact, are always mentioned, but they're not that big. They're only £4 to £5 billion in themselves. You would, of course, save a lot more on the planes to fly off them, but those planes may need buying anyway, or perhaps not. The RAF may wish to become basically an entirely Eurofighter force, but something will have to go. Something large, in fact, will have to go, and that's what nobody is willing to say. What will it be? Like, as I said earlier, I think it would be nice if politicians actually put their colours up the mast and let us vote on it, and we could have some democracy rather than, you know, a review process that'll be largely behind closed doors once the next government's in power.
Lewis Page talking to Ben earlier.